Vera Calloway walked out of the Rowan County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in early March with a cashier's check for $4,200, a cardboard box, and the understanding that 44 years had come to exactly that. The check was her portion of a joint savings account that had once held $34,000. The box held what Roy's attorney had designated as her personal effects: a handful of photographs, her mother's Bible bound with a rubber band at the spine, and a ceramic sugar bowl she and Roy had bought at a craft fair in Gatlinburg the summer their youngest started high school. Roy's attorney had worn a new suit. Roy himself had not come. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She stood on the courthouse steps with the box under one arm. The morning air was cold and wet, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet. A sparrow crossed between two oaks at the far end of the parking lot and disappeared into the bare branches without a sound. Down the block, a man loaded equipment into a pickup truck without looking up. The street moved on in every direction, completely unchanged by what had just happened inside that building. She had $7 in her coat pocket. Paper bills, folded together. The cashier's check was beside them, still uncashed. She needed to eat, and she needed somewhere to sleep, and she needed, before she could think about either of those things, to get off these steps. She walked to the edge of the parking lot and sat on the low concrete barrier at the curb. She set the box beside her. She took her mother's Bible out of the box and held it in both hands and opened it to no particular page. The Bible had belonged to Edna Marsh, Vera's mother, bought in 1961 from a church book sale in Harriman, Tennessee. The name Edna Marsh was stamped on the front cover in ink faded now almost to gray. The spine had been repaired twice over the years, the rubber band there now to hold the binding through one more reading. Edna had written dates in the margins and penciled small notations into some passages, then erased most of them later, as if she'd changed her mind about what deserved to be marked permanently. Vera had known this about her mother's Bible since she was a girl. She sat on the parking barrier now and held it because it was the most familiar thing in the box, and she needed something familiar. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when Patsy Drummond pulled up. Patsy had been Vera's neighbor on Maple Street for 18 years, and she was the kind of woman who, upon seeing someone she knew sitting alone on a parking barrier outside the courthouse with a cardboard box, did not stop to consider whether pulling over was convenient. She pulled over, got out, and put her arm around Vera's shoulders and held on for a full moment before she said a word. Some situations want conversation and some want presence, and Patsy Drummond had always known the difference. "Do you have anywhere to go tonight?" she asked finally. Vera thought about it honestly. Dale was in Nashville, 43 years old, careful and distant through most of the proceedings in the way that told you everything without confirming anything. 2 phone calls in 8 months, both of them with the quality of someone gathering information rather than offering anything. Sandra was in Knoxville, 41, a guidance counselor at a high school there. Not cruel, not present. The particular kind of absent that involves genuine sorrow and no action. Vera had a cousin in Maryville and a niece she hadn't spoken to in 2 years, and no one else she could call, without it costing her something she wasn't willing to spend right now. "Nowhere," she said. "Not tonight." Patsy nodded once and picked up the cardboard box. "Come on then." Roy Calloway had not always been the man he became at the end. That was the part of it Vera kept returning to in the months of the proceedings. Not from sentimentality, but from the need to understand something. He had not been, for most of their 44 years, the man who signed papers designed to take the house out from under her. He had been attentive when the children were small, steady at his work, the kind of man who showed up when he said he would and kept his word in the ways that counted. They had moved to Maple Street in 1985 when Dale was 7 and Sandra was 5. They had paid the house off in 2007, a Saturday afternoon in June, Roy bringing home a bottle of wine to celebrate a thing they had worked toward together for 22 years. She had believed in the marriage. She had believed in it up until the evening she found the phone bill on the kitchen counter and read the call history and recognized that several numbers appeared too often to be work-related. She had not panicked. She had sat at the kitchen table with the phone bill and thought carefully for about 20 minutes, and then she had waited for Roy to come home. She asked him directly that evening. He did not deny it. The woman's name was Carol. She worked at the Agricultural Extension Office in Oak Ridge and was in her mid-50s. Roy said the marriage had been over for years in any sense that mattered, which was the kind of statement that positions itself as honesty, but is actually designed to make the listener feel foolish for not having already known. Vera had not known. She had been teaching school and visiting her mother as Edna's health declined, and keeping the house and being Roy's wife. She had been living what she believed was a shared life. If that was a failure of attention, it was not the only failure in the room that evening. He filed 8 months after that conversation. Vera retained a local attorney, a woman named Patricia Geyer, who had done divorces in Rowan County for 30 years and had no illusions about how they went. Patricia laid it out plainly. The 2011 refinancing paperwork had included a joint ownership structure that, under Tennessee law, gave Roy's attorney a workable basis for arguing unequal division. Vera had signed those papers without consulting her own lawyer because Roy had described them as routine and she had believed him. Patricia said, more than once, that this was unfortunately common and that the lesson from it was not one she could have used until now. The house sold for $298,000 before the divorce finalized. Roy had already moved in with Carol by then. The savings account, which had carried a balance of $34,000 when Vera last checked 2 years prior, had been drawn down steadily to $8,400, of which Vera's share after the split was $4,200. She kept the sugar bowl and the Bible and the photographs his attorney had apparently selected at random. The day she sat on the courthouse steps was not the worst day of those 14 months. The worst day was the evening she sat in Patricia Geyer's office and heard the final terms laid out and understood, fully and finally, that there was no mechanism left to challenge them. That day she had driven home to Maple Street, walked through every room of the house she had kept for 38 years, and stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the raised garden beds Roy had built against the south fence. He had built those beds from cedar boards one weekend when the children were teenagers. She had grown tomatoes there every summer since. Then she had gone upstairs and started packing. Patsy's guest room had a quilt on the bed and a window looking over the backyard, where 2 squirrels were working through the sunflower seeds in the feeder outside with complete and dedicated focus. Vera sat on the edge of the bed that first evening and opened the cardboard box. She went through it without lingering. The photographs she divided into 2 piles. Most were from Roy's family gatherings where she had been present but peripheral, people she would not see again and had no reason to keep. She set those aside. The photographs of her children and her mother she kept. The sugar bowl she placed on the dresser. The Bible she opened properly for the first time since it had been packed. She went through it page by page, the way her mother had always done with the books she kept close. She found the grocery list from 1974, written in her mother's handwriting on the back of an envelope. A photograph of herself at 9 years old, standing in front of a garden and squinting at the camera. A newspaper clipping about a church social, the paper so old it came apart at the fold. Near the back of the Bible, tucked between the concordance and the final blank page, she found a folded document. She unfolded it across her knees. It was a deed. Tanner's Creek Freight Depot. Parcel 18, Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Property description, station building, 2,200 square feet, constructed 1921. Adjacent freight yard, loading platform, and goods storage shed. For 6 acres total. Transfer of ownership from Southern Railway Company to Earl Monroe Marsh, October 14, 1961. Her grandfather's name. She read it twice. Then she sat still with it in her lap and looked at the window. Earl Monroe Marsh had been the freight agent at the Tanner's Creek Depot for most of his working life, from the mid-1920s until the Southern Railway closed the line in 1962. He had died in 1971 when Vera was 10. She remembered him in the specific, partial way of childhood memory. The smell of pipe tobacco and the hard candies he kept in a glass dish on his desk, the large hands, the long silences that never felt uncomfortable, the way he said her name with the emphasis placed on the second syllable, as though her name were something worth taking time with. He had not struck her as a man who owned things beyond his house and his tools. A deed to a train station had never entered any version of what she knew about him. Her mother had kept this document in her Bible for what could have been decades without ever mentioning it. Whether Edna had known what it was, or had filed it there and forgotten it was there, Vera could not know now. What she knew was that the property it described had been part of the Marsh family estate when Edna died 2 years ago, and had not been included in the probate inventory because no one had known it existed, which meant it might still be hers to claim, if the taxes hadn't already taken it. She showed it to Patsy after dinner. Patsy read it twice and handed it back. "Did your mama ever say a word about this?" "Not once." "Then you need to call the county records office first thing in the morning." The woman at the Bledsoe County office pulled up the parcel number while Vera waited on the line. The property had been tax delinquent since 2019. Back taxes totaled $632. The county had sent notices to Edna Marsh's last known address, a house in Harriman that had sold 2 years earlier after Edna's death. The letters had come back undeliverable. Vera explained that she was Edna Marsh's daughter and the estate's sole heir. The woman told her that without a formal amendment to the probate filing, the county's foreclosure proceedings would continue regardless of any heir's interest. The property was scheduled for the Bledsoe County delinquent property auction in 2 weeks. If Vera wished to halt proceedings by paying the back taxes, the total with administrative fees was $711, due by the Friday prior to the auction. Vera thanked her and set the phone down. She sat at Patsy's kitchen table with the deed and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. $711 was money she needed for what came after. She had no guarantee the building was worth reclaiming. A freight station abandoned since 1962 could be rubble or close to it. But it was her grandfather's name on that deed, and it was her mother's Bible that had held it for all this time. She drove out to Bledsoe County the following Saturday to look at it before she decided. Tanner's Creek was an unincorporated community south of Pikeville on a two-lane road that wound through bottomland farms and stretches of second-growth timber. She turned onto the gravel approach off the main county road, marked by a rusted metal sign, so weathered she had to stop and get out to read the letters. Tanner's Creek Depot. And below that in smaller letters, Southern Railway Freight Agent. She drove up the gravel track and stopped at the edge of the old freight yard. The building was brick. Dark red brick, streaked gray and black from decades of rain and standing water. 2 stories on the main structure, a single-story freight room addition to the right with a roofline that bowed visibly in the middle. The station platform ran the full length of the building, its wooden planking long since gone, the concrete foundation still standing. All the windows of the main structure were intact, filmed with grime. The lower sills rotted through, but the frames themselves holding. One window on the upper floor had lost its glass and been covered from inside with a sheet of tin nailed flat across the opening. Behind the building, the freight yard had gone entirely to briar and wild privet, shoulder height and tangled. A rusted loading crane stood at the far end of the platform, turned halfway, and stopped there, likely sometime in 1962. 2 sections of rail track remained at the yard's edge, half buried in decades of growth. She sat in her car and looked at it for a long time. The freight room addition was bad. She could see that from where she parked. The roofline sag at the center was serious. The far corner of the eave had dropped, which meant something in the support structure had given way. That would not be a small repair. But the main building stood plumb, all 3 visible sides of it straight. No lean or bow she could see from the road. The brick showed its age, but showed no failure. Whoever had built this station in 1921 had built it to last, and it had lasted 60-plus years of abandonment in the Tennessee hills, and it was still standing. That told you something. She drove home and thought about it for 3 days. Then she went to the auction. The Bledsoe County Delinquent Property Auction was held on a Saturday morning in the county building off the main square in Pikeville, in a low-ceilinged room with folding chairs set in rows. Vera arrived at 9:40, 20 minutes before it opened. She had the deed in her handbag and $7 in her coat pocket. The $7 was deliberate. She had decided the night before what she was willing to bid. About 30 people filled the room by the time Harris, the auctioneer, took the podium at exactly 10 o'clock. Mostly men in their 40s and 50s. Work clothes on some, business casual on others. They talked among themselves with the settled ease of people who attended these regularly and had arrived with a number already in mind. One man in the back row cross-referenced properties on a county map on his laptop. A younger pair near the window compared notes on a yellow legal pad. No one acknowledged Vera when she took her seat near the aisle. Harris ran through the format without preamble. 22 properties today, all as is. No warranties, no exceptions. Cash, cashier's check, or money order, due immediately upon sale. The first 11 properties moved in under an hour. A commercial lot near the highway, vacant residential parcels, a flood-damaged house that sold for $8,000. Vera watched how the room worked. When there was genuine interest, the atmosphere sharpened perceptibly. When there wasn't, people checked their phones. Property number 12, Harris said. Tanner's Creek Freight Depot, Bledsoe County. Station building, 2,200 square feet, 1921 construction. Adjacent freight yard, 6 acres. Tax delinquent since 2019. County inspector has flagged the freight room addition for structural concerns. Main building structurally sound, but in poor condition. No utilities. Access via unpaved gravel approach. Last assessed value, $14,000. He looked up from the sheet. Opening bid, $1. A few people lifted their heads from their phones. A man in a canvas jacket near the window shook his head slowly. Someone at the back said something to the man beside him, and that man laughed, short and quiet. No one bid. Brick exterior, Harris said. 1921 construction. Do I have any interest at all? Nothing. $7, Vera said. The room turned. Harris looked at her over the tops of his glasses. $7, he said. All right, 7. Do I have 8? He scanned the room. $8. Anyone? The man by the window shook his head again. The man at the back who had laughed was looking at Vera now with an expression she recognized from years of teaching middle school. Not cruelty exactly, but the comfortable assumption that he already understood the situation. Going once at $7, Harris said. Going twice. He paused the full count. Sold. Tanner's Creek Freight Depot to the woman in the third row for $7. Vera walked to the front and counted 7 $1 bills onto the table. Harris transferred the deed to her name, stamped the paperwork, and slid the manila envelope across to her. Inside, the new deed, a property description, 5 years of tax records, and a single key on a plain metal ring. The key was brass, old, heavy in the way that came from solid casting rather than hollow. The bow was stamped with the number 8. Congratulations, Harris said, without particular warmth or coldness. The property is yours. She picked up the envelope and walked back up the aisle toward the door. Near the exit, the man in the canvas jacket touched her elbow, not unkindly, in the way of someone who feels they have an obligation to say something. The freight room roof won't make another hard winter, he said. I had an engineer look at it last year when I was considering the place. He told me to walk away. Vera looked at him. I've seen it, she said. She thanked him and went through the door. She knows, she heard someone say, as it closed behind her. That evening, she told Patsy she was moving to Tanner's Creek in the morning. Patsy was quiet for a moment. She looked at Vera the way she looked at things she was deciding how to handle. Then she said, it was 26 degrees last night. Vera, there's no heat out there. No plumbing. That freight room roof. I have a sleeping bag. I have the car. Patsy didn't argue further. She went to the utility closet and came back with a battery-powered lantern, a wool blanket she'd had since the last ice storm, and a box of emergency candles. She went to the kitchen and put together a bag, canned soup, crackers, peanut butter, a thermos she filled from the coffee maker. She wrote a name and number on the back of an envelope. Ray Perkins, she said. He does contractor work in that part of the county. He's honest, and he'll tell you the truth. She tucked the envelope in with the food and set everything on the counter. Vera stood in that kitchen and looked at what Patsy had done without being asked. Thank you, she said. Just that, without adding anything to it. You'd do the same, Patsy said. It was true. Vera loaded the car as the afternoon went gray and drove south toward Bledsoe County. The roads narrowed past the county line, the tree cover thickening on both sides. She passed through Pikeville and continued south on the Tulane Road, then turned onto the gravel approach as the last of the daylight was pulling back behind the ridge. She backed the car into the clearing and cut the engine. The silence of the place came forward immediately, not the silence of emptiness, the particular silence of a space that has been still for a very long time and knows how to hold it. The brick walls of the depot stood pale in the last light, the freight yard dark and overgrown behind them. She got out of the car with the lantern and the key. She walked the length of the platform foundation first, testing her footing on the concrete, checking for gaps or failure points. The foundation held solid the full length. She reached the main entrance, the double doors set under the brick arch, and tried the key. It didn't fit. The lock was a modern padlock, newer than the door it hung on. Someone had been here at some point and replaced the original lock. The brass key in her hand was original to the building, which meant it opened something else. She walked around to the south face of the freight room addition. There was a door there, simpler, set into the brick at the point where the addition joined the main structure. She tried the key. It turned. The door scraped inward on the concrete slab, bottom edge dragging, releasing a smell of old wood and dry dust and cold air and something under it all that was harder to name. The petroleum smell of machinery at rest, and beneath that, the faint smell of old paper and the passage of a great deal of time. She clicked on the lantern and stepped inside. The freight room was a long rectangle, 40 feet end to end, wide plank oak floors gone gray with age. Empty wooden shelving ran along the far wall. A long workbench stood to her right, bare except for a thick coat of dust. A row of wooden pegs above the workbench held nothing. Near the far left corner, the ceiling had failed, plastered down in a rough pile on the floor beneath it. She stayed to the right, where the ceiling held and the floor was solid underfoot. She moved slowly through the room, her footsteps the only sound in the building. At the back wall, she found a door. It was different from the freight room entrance in every way. Narrower, built from what looked like chestnut rather than pine, the grain tighter, the wood darker even under the dust. The lock was a built-in mechanism, original to the building. A brass plate, a round keyhole, the kind of hardware made to last a century and built with the expectation that it would need to. Above the door, someone had stenciled letters in black paint, now faded to the ghost of themselves, Stationmaster. Vera stood in front of it with the lantern raised. She put the key in the lock. The cylinder had seized with rust and decades of disuse, and it did not turn at first attempt, or at the second. She worked it without forcing, steady even pressure, back and forth in the cylinder, patient in the way that patience is not the same as waiting. It is active, it requires the body, it costs something. She worked it in the cold of the freight room for several minutes. Then the lock turned. She pressed on the door. It held for a moment against something, years of accumulated grime and settled dust along the frame, and then it gave with a tearing sound, and the door swung inward. She held the lantern through the opening before she stepped in. The room was perhaps 15 feet square. A desk, a wooden chair, 2 walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves. On the shelves, ledgers, dozens of them, arranged in order, the spines labeled in handwriting she didn't recognize. Stacks of documents, some in folders, some loose. And on one shelf, a row of flat rectangular objects wrapped in brown paper and tied with lengths of cotton string, perhaps a dozen of them, each one the size of a small painting. On the desk, something covered with a piece of cloth, its shape beneath suggesting a stack of papers or a book or both. The floor in this room was narrower planks than the freight room, better preserved, the grain smooth and close. As though the room had been sealed early enough to be protected from everything the freight room had been through. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it in the lantern light. The cold of this room was different from the cold of the freight room, not just the temperature. The weight of stillness in a space left exactly as someone had arranged it and never touched again. Her grandfather had sat at that desk. Her grandfather, who smelled of tobacco and kept hard candies in a glass dish and said her name as though it had 2 syllables worth taking time with, had sat in that wooden chair and kept those ledgers and wrapped those objects in brown paper and tied them with string and then locked the door behind him for the last time in 1962 and left all of it exactly there. She did not go in yet. She was not ready. Whatever was in that room had been waiting 62 years, and it would wait through one more night. She turned back to the freight room and spread her sleeping bag on the clear section of floor, away from the collapsed corner. She set the camp stove on the workbench and heated a can of soup and ate it standing, her eyes on the open Stationmaster's door. She could see the edge of the desk in the lantern light and the corner of the cloth-covered object on it. She ate and looked at it and let the question sit. She was 71 years old. She owned a condemned freight station 12 miles from a town where no one knew her name. She had $7 less than she'd started the day with. She had a sleeping bag on a cold oak floor and a key that had opened a door closed since 1962. Outside, wind moved through the privet in the freight yard with a low, continuous sound, the same sound it had probably been making for decades in the empty dark of this place. She lay down and pulled the sleeping bag around her and looked up at the freight room ceiling. She was not done. She was barely started. She had opened the door. Whatever her grandfather had left in that room would tell her the rest when the light came back. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the overgrown freight yard, a bird called once, briefly, then was quiet. Morning was coming. Morning came through the freight room windows as a pale strip of light that widened slowly across the oak floor. Vera had slept longer than she expected, 6 hours at least, which she took as evidence that her body had decided the situation was survivable. She lay still for a moment with the sleeping bag pulled close and looked at the stationmaster's door standing open across the room. The lantern had run down through the night. In the early morning gray, the room beyond the doorway was dim and quiet, the desk visible at the far edge of the light, the shelves behind it in shadow. Everything exactly as she had left it. She got up. She boiled water on the camp stove, made coffee from the packet Patsy had put in the bag, and stood at the freight room's south window with the mug in both hands. The glass was too clouded to see much through, but she could make out the shape of the freight yard and the ridge behind it. The sky above the ridge going from gray to pale blue. A few degrees below freezing still. No wind. She drank the coffee and thought about what she was about to do. She was not a person who performed reluctance when there was something to be done. What she had felt the previous evening standing at the threshold of the stationmaster's room was not hesitation. It was the recognition that some things deserve to be approached with the full weight of your attention, and the end of a long day in a cold building was not the right conditions for that. Morning was. Coffee and daylight and a clear head. She set the mug on the workbench and went to the stationmaster's door. The room was small and cold and full. She stood just inside the entrance with the lantern turned up to full brightness and turned slowly to take in all of it. The shelves to her left held freight ledgers. She could see that clearly now. Standard railroad issue, the spines all in the same format. Tanner's Creek Depot, a year range, the Southern Railway stamp. They ran from 1924 to 1962 in continuous order, 38 years without a gap. Her grandfather had filed every one of them in sequence, in this room, at that desk. The shelves to her right held something different. A smaller set of ledgers, narrower, without the railroad stamp. A stack of documents in a brown folder. A tin canister with a fitted lid. And a row of brown paper packages, perhaps a dozen of them, arranged along the middle shelf with the careful spacing of someone who had placed them there expecting them to stay. She started with the freight ledgers, not because she expected to find anything significant in them, but because she wanted to understand her grandfather's handwriting before she touched anything else. She pulled 1937 from the shelf and opened it across her palms. The handwriting was small and even, leaning slightly to the right, each entry dated and precise. Shipment received, contents, weight, consignee, departure date. Earl Monroe Marsh, freight agent, recording the ordinary business of a Tennessee railroad depot through the Depression and the war and the long post-war years, one entry at a time, for 38 years. She read a page. She read another. She put the ledger back. Then she went to the smaller ones on the right-hand shelf. There were 6 of them. No railroad stamp. Unlabeled on the spines. She opened the first. The handwriting was the same, but the entries were different. Dates, and below each date, a few lines of personal notation. The first was from March of 1931. Rain. Again today. Finished the ridge above Kettle Creek. The color in the fog here is not what I expected. Not gray. Something between gray and gold, the way old wood gets. I will try again tomorrow morning before the shift starts. She turned a page. April 1931. May. June. Each entry a few lines, sometimes only 2 sentences, sometimes half a page. Notes on light and weather and color. Notes on what had worked and what had not. Notes on the valley in every season and at every hour of the early morning. Written by a man who was clearly looking at it with the focused attention of someone trying to capture something that kept almost escaping him. She put the ledger down and went to the brown paper packages. She lifted the nearest one from the shelf. Light, perhaps a pound. The paper dry and intact, the cotton string tied in a flat knot that came loose easily. She unwrapped it with care. Inside was a stretched canvas, small, perhaps 9 inches by 12. A landscape. The Sequatchie Valley from the ridge above it, painted in oil, the colors muted and exact, the specific gray-green of Tennessee hills in late winter, the dark line of the creek bottom, the sky and the quality of light just after sunrise when everything is still and flat, and has not yet committed to the day. It was modest in scale and not modest at all in what it saw. She looked at it for a long time. She unwrapped the next one. A second landscape. The freight yard in full summer, viewed from the station platform. The loading crane at the far end caught in afternoon light. The rust of the crane rendered color by color, the heat shimmer above the tin roofing of the freight shed, the shadows of the yard boards going long and narrow in the late sun, painted from almost exactly where she was now standing. She unwrapped a third, a fourth, a fifth, all landscapes of the valley and the country immediately around the depot. The ridge above the station in snow, the bare tree line reduced to a dark edge against white sky, the creek bottom in autumn, the sycamore trunks white among the color, a farmhouse in the middle distance with a field of dried corn behind it, the stalks catching evening light at an angle that made them look almost like gold wire. A winter sunset behind the western ridge, the sky rendered in the particular color of December light at elevation, that brief narrow band of orange going to gray that appears for perhaps 10 minutes before the dark takes it. She unwrapped all 12. She carried them out to the freight room and laid them on the floor in rows where the morning light coming through the south window was best. 12 small canvases, laid out across a swept oak floor. 30 years of early mornings in the Tennessee hills, made by a man who had not thought of himself as an artist and had told no one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She went back to the stationmaster's desk. The cloth was a piece of dark wool, folded neat. She lifted it. Beneath it was a letter, 3 pages in Earl's handwriting, the pages held together with a rusted paper clip. Beneath the letter, a sealed envelope. On the envelope, in the same handwriting, 4 words, "For whoever opens this." She sat down in the wooden chair. It was solid under her, the joints tight after everything. A chair built for a man who had sat in it every working day for decades. She read the letter. Earl Marsh had begun painting in the spring of 1931 when a neighbor gave him a set of oil paints she had bought for a grandchild who hadn't taken to them. He was 28 years old and had no training. He began by painting what was directly in front of him when he arrived at the depot before his shift, the freight yard, the ridge, the light at that hour. His wife Beatrice, he wrote, had made her position clear when she found out. Art was a waste of time that paid nothing and produced nothing and belonged to people with time and money to spare, neither of which they had. He did not argue with her about this because Beatrice was not wrong about their circumstances. They had 4 children and a mortgage and a freight agent's wage. He painted before his shifts because that was the only hour that belonged entirely to him, the time before the rest of the world came to work. He painted for 31 years. He never showed any of it to Beatrice. He kept everything in the stationmaster's room, which was his office and his alone, and Beatrice had no reason to come to the depot. He did not think of himself as an artist. He thought of himself as a man who looked at the valley every morning and found, over time, that he wanted to keep some record of what he saw. When the Southern Railway closed the Tanner's Creek line in the autumn of 1962, Earl was 59 years old. He locked the stationmaster's room on his last day. He had arranged for the depot's deed to be transferred to his name in the final weeks before closure, a modest transaction the railroad agreed to for a nominal sum because the property had no remaining value to them. He did not tell Beatrice about the deed. He left everything in the room and went home and worked for the county highway department for the next 9 years and said nothing. Near the end of the letter he had written, "I don't know who will find this or when. I don't know if the paintings are any good. I am not qualified to judge that. What I know is that looking at this valley for 30 years changed the way I saw everything, not just the valley, and I am glad I did it even though I did it alone. If the paintings are worth anything, I hope they go somewhere they can be seen. If they aren't, then this was still the best part of my working life, and I have no regrets about any of it." The letter ended there. Vera sat with it in her lap for a long time. The cold of the room pressed steadily through her coat. She had stopped noticing it for a while. She thought about her grandfather at 28, arriving at this depot before his shift with a set of borrowed paints and no instruction, setting up at the yard's edge and painting what was in front of him. She thought about him doing that for 31 years, morning after morning, before the world came to work, in the quiet of a place that was his and only his at that hour. She thought about him packing each finished canvas in brown paper and setting it on the shelf, and going home to Beatrice and the children and saying nothing about where he had been or what he had made. She thought about her mother carrying the depot deed in her Bible for decades, tucked between the concordance and the final blank page, never once mentioning it. And she thought about the building standing here through all those years after Earl locked the door, brick walls plumb in every kind of weather, holding the room inside exactly as he had left it. She folded the letter along its original lines and placed it back on the desk. She opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet, and on it, in Earl's handwriting, a list of names. 12 names, each one corresponding to a number from 1 to 12. Below each name, a brief description of what the painting showed. He had titled every one. The winter sunset painting was called Late December, Depot Ridge. The farmhouse painting was After Harvest, Looking East. The freight yard in summer was simply Crane, July Afternoon. He had known what he had. He had cataloged it and sealed it and left it for whoever came. She went outside. The morning had gone clear and cold and bright, the March sky the specific blue that follows weather. The ridge above the depot caught the early sun fully. The overgrown freight yard caught it too, the loading crane throwing a long shadow across the briars. She stood at the edge of the platform foundation and looked at the building. She had a condemned freight station and 12 oil paintings and a letter from a man who had been dead for 50 years. She had a sleeping bag and a camp stove and a contractor's number on the back of an envelope. She had $4,200 and no plan beyond the next thing that needed doing. The next thing was the freight room roof. She drove to the Crossroads store 4 miles up the county road and used the payphone to reach Ray Perkins. He arrived 2 hours later in a white truck with a level and a framing square visible behind the seat, and the quiet manner of a man who had spent 30 years assessing broken things and being honest about which portion of them could be fixed. He shook Vera's hand without comment on anything he saw, and she walked him through the building. He went through the freight room slowly, testing the floor planks with his weight, checking the wall-to-floor joints, tapping the stone foundation piers. Then he went to the addition and examined the roof from outside, pressing his hands against the bowed section, checking the eave, looking at where the addition joined the main structure. He came back and stood beside her. "Main building is solid," he said. "Foundation and brick both. The freight room joists need looking at properly, but from what I can see they're carrying their load. The bad ceiling section on the left came from a failed gutter joint that ran water into the same spot for years. That's a straightforward fix. The floor throughout is sound." He paused. "The addition roof won't last another month of weather like we've had. The rafters are failed on the far end. Heavy snow or a hard rain, and you'll lose the back section completely. What would stabilize it?" she asked. "Just stop the failure. Buy it another season." He gave her a number. A smaller number than she expected, what he could do in a week with materials, enough to brace and cover the critical section. Full replacement was a spring job. She said yes. He said he could start Monday. Before he left, she brought him back inside and showed him the paintings, laid out on the freight room floor in the south window light. Ray Perkins did not say more than he meant. That was something Vera had noted and appreciated from their first conversation. He stood and looked at the paintings for a full 2 minutes without speaking. "These are from in there?" He nodded toward the stationmaster's door. "My grandfather's. He painted them here, mornings before his shift, for 31 years. Never showed them to anyone." Ray looked at them again. All of them, one by one, before he spoke. "I know a woman in Pikeville," he said. "Margaret Sohn. She runs a gallery out of an old hardware store on the main street. She knows regional art, Appalachian work specifically. I can't tell you what these are, but she could, and she'd tell you the truth about it. Call her," Vera said. He drove away down the gravel track. Vera spent the rest of that day doing what could be done without tools or lumber. She cleared the remainder of the freight room floor, sweeping 6 decades of accumulated debris toward the south door in long, slow passes. She moved the paintings back into the stationmaster's room and arranged them along the wall where they would be protected. She removed the modern padlock hasp from the main entrance doors using a pry bar and a flat stone, which took 40 minutes of careful work, and propped both doors open from inside. Light moved through the double doors and across the freight room floor for what was probably the first time since 1962. She stood in the doorway and looked at what the light did to the room. She ate soup and sat on the cleared floor that evening with the stationmaster's door open and the lantern burning, and read through the first 3 personal ledgers. Each one covered a season or 2 of mornings. Each one the same, even handwriting moving through light conditions and color problems, and the slow accumulation of a man learning to see. In the 3rd ledger, from 1944, she found one entry that stopped her. March 14th, Vera's name, he wrote. Vera Louise, they're calling her. My daughter's girl. Not 2 weeks old. I drove over to Harriman on Sunday and held her for a while. She has good hands. Long fingers. Maybe she'll do something with them. She sat with that for a long time. Her grandfather had written about her before she could walk, before she could have known he existed in any meaningful way, before she had any idea that she would one day sit on his freight room floor, 71 years later, reading those words by lantern light. She put the ledger down and let that thought sit without doing anything with it. Ray came Monday as promised, with his nephew Eddie, who worked the roof without much conversation and with the focused efficiency of someone who had been on bad roofs before. Ray worked inside on the ceiling damage, pulling the failed plaster, inspecting the joists, sealing the gutter joint that had let water in for years. The joists were sound. The damage had been entirely surface. By Wednesday, the addition roof was braced and covered at the critical section. Not rebuilt, braced, enough to hold through spring. The freight room ceiling was stripped back to the bare joists in the damaged area, open to the rafters, but dry and structurally solid. He told her what he found in the structure above the damaged section. Whoever built this in 1921 built it right, he said. You'll have a good roof when you get to it. Margaret Sohn was coming Saturday. The days between were good days in the way that days of physical work can be good. Vera cleared the freight yard immediately behind the south door, cutting the briars back with the folding handsaw Ray had left her, opening a clear path through to the loading area. The work was hard on her hands and her back. She stopped when she needed to and walked the platform, and then went back. By Thursday evening, 20 feet of yard had been cleared to bare ground, and the old loading surface was visible beneath, cracked concrete that had held its position for a century. She walked 4 miles to the Crossroads store and arranged to forward her mail to the depot's rural route address and redirected her Social Security payments. The SSA clerk told her the first redirected check would arrive within 2 billing cycles. She bought a calling card from Cheryl behind the counter and walked back in the early dark. Friday, she cleaned the Stationmaster's room properly. She moved everything onto the freight room floor in careful order, wiped every shelf with a damp cloth, checked the wood for failure. The shelves were solid chestnut throughout, the same close grain and tight joinery as the door. She replaced everything in the same careful order, freight ledgers by year, personal ledgers together, the paintings in their wrapping with new string from the store. In the bottom right drawer of the desk, on this closer examination, she found what she had missed on her first day. A tin box, roughly the size of a hardback book, sealed around the lid with a thin line of old wax. A small keyhole set into the front face. No label. No indication of contents. She shook it gently. Something shifted inside. A dry movement, flat objects, not heavy. Papers, or something similar. She tried the brass key from the ring. Wrong size entirely. She worked a thin knife blade along the wax seal, careful not to force it. The wax held firm around the full perimeter. Whatever Earl had sealed in that box had been sealed with the intention that it would not be opened by accident or idle curiosity. It would need the right key, which she did not yet have. She set it back in the drawer. There would be time for it. Margaret Sohn arrived Saturday morning in a green sedan, camera bag over one shoulder. 64 years old, silver hair cut close, reading glasses on a chain. She looked at the building from the clearing with the focused attention of someone already making assessments before she reached the door. Ray was there to make the introduction and then stood back. Vera brought her inside and let her look without directing her. Margaret moved through the freight room slowly, taking in the cleared floor and the repaired ceiling section and the open main doors. She went to the Stationmaster's room and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the shelves and the desk and the chair. Then Vera unwrapped the paintings one by one and leaned them along the freight room wall in the morning light. Margaret did not speak while Vera worked. She stood back and looked at each painting as it appeared, then moved forward to examine each one closely, glasses on now, bending low. When all 12 were out and leaning along the wall in the south window light, she straightened and stepped back and looked at the full row of them for a long time. The room was quiet. Ray stood near the workbench with his hands in his pockets. Who painted these? Margaret asked. Earl Monroe Marsh. My grandfather. Freight agent here from 1924 to 1962. He painted them before his morning shifts for 31 years. He never showed them to anyone. Margaret looked at her, then back at the paintings. Where did you find them? Vera told her, briefly and in order. The deed in the Bible. The auction. The key. The stationmaster's room. The letter. 62 years, Margaret said, mostly to herself. She picked up one of the canvases and turned it over to examine the back. She checked the stretcher bars, the canvas prep, the edge of the paint along the tacking margin. She took a small loop from her camera bag and examined the surface of the paint on two of the larger canvases. After several minutes, she set them down and looked at Vera directly. I need to make some calls before I tell you what I believe I'm looking at, she said. But I can tell you this much now. She looked at the row of paintings. These are not the work of someone who didn't know what he was doing, even if he didn't know he knew. The technique is self-taught. You can see that in certain passages, in how he handled the paint in the early ones versus the later ones, the way his touch changed over time. But the eye behind them is not teachable. You either see this way or you don't, and your grandfather saw this way for 30 years and made 12 paintings that I would be very surprised to learn have no significance. She paused. I want to bring a colleague here. He's an art historian at the Knoxville Museum who has spent 20 years on Appalachian regionalist painters, documented and undocumented. If what I think I'm seeing is what I think I'm seeing, you need his credentials behind it before anything else happens. Vera looked at the paintings along the wall. He said in the letter he didn't know if they were any good, she said. Margaret looked at her with an expression that was careful and clear. He was wrong about that, she said. She took photographs of each painting and of the stationmaster's room and the ledgers and the letter on the desk. She told Vera she would call her colleague that evening. She shook Vera's hand at the door of the depot and looked back at the building once before she got in her car. Ray watched her drive down the gravel track and turned to Vera. What did you think? He asked. Vera looked at the main entrance doors standing open, the light coming through and crossing the freight room floor. I think I need to fix this roof before it starts raining again, she said. Ray almost smiled. He went to his truck and pulled out a bag he had brought along, setting it on the platform foundation without comment. Inside, a thermos, 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper, a bag of apples. He had not asked whether she needed it. He had simply brought it, the way some people decide a thing belongs in the arrangement and don't make a point of saying so. They sat on the platform foundation in the March sun and ate. The freight yard spread out behind them, the section she had cleared already showing a different character from the overgrown rest of it. The loading crane stood at the far end, rust orange against the pale sky. The arm turned halfway and stopped there where Earl or one of the other men had left it in 1962. She looked at it for a while. In the desk drawer inside, the sealed tin box sat waiting, its keyhole small and specific, its contents unknown. She had not found the key for it yet. It was possible the key was somewhere in the room, and she had not looked carefully enough. It was possible Earl had kept it somewhere else entirely. It was possible she would have to find a way in without a key when she was ready for that. She was not ready for it yet. There was a roof to finish and a floor to assess and a freight yard that needed weeks of clearing and a woman in Pikeville who was making a phone call that evening that might change what Vera understood about what she had found. One thing at a time. That had always been how she worked. She finished the apple and folded the paper bag and stood up. Spring was 3 weeks away on the calendar. In this part of the country, that meant nothing in terms of weather, but it meant something in terms of light. The days were getting longer. There was more working time each day than there had been a week ago, and there would be more next week still. She went back inside and got to work. Margaret Soane's colleague arrived on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. His name was Thomas Adler, art historian at the Knoxville Museum of Art. 20 years spent studying Appalachian regionalist painters, documented and otherwise. He drove up the gravel track in a university vehicle and brought a conservator named Priya, who carried a field case, and said very little. Vera met them at the main entrance and brought them in without ceremony. Thomas Adler did what Margaret had done. He walked the freight room, stood in the stationmaster's doorway, looked at the shelves and the desk and the chair. Then Vera brought the paintings out. She had them leaning along the wall in the same arrangement as before. Morning light through the south windows, the freight room floor swept clean around them. He moved along the row without speaking, crouching at each canvas, standing back, shifting his angle to change the light. He asked Priya to look at two of the paintings with the conservator's loupe, and they conferred quietly. When he stood back and looked at the full row of 12, he had the expression of someone whose expectation has been confirmed and who still finds the confirmation surprising. He looked at Vera. Your grandfather had no formal training of any kind? None that I've found any record of. And he painted from 1931 to 1962. 31 years. The ledgers document it. He nodded slowly. The technique is self-taught. You can see that in the early canvases, the way he worked out paint handling through repetition rather than instruction. But by the mid-1940s, he had developed something entirely his own. The way he reads light in the valley paintings from that period is not comparable to anything in the documented regional tradition. It stands apart from it. He paused. There are perhaps a dozen painters working in this period in Appalachia whose work has received serious scholarly attention. Your grandfather should be among them. He isn't, because nobody knew he existed. He existed only in this room, behind a locked door, for 62 years. He thought they might not be any good, Vera said. He wrote that in the letter. Adler thought about that. He was the wrong person to judge, he said. He looked at them every morning for 30 years and saw every place where what he intended and what he achieved didn't match. That is not the same as seeing what they are. The museum had a formal process for exactly this kind of discovery. Adler would make the proposal himself. He could promise nothing about what the institution would decide, but he could tell her the work warranted the proposal being made. Let me think about it, Vera said. She would not be rushed on her grandfather's behalf. They left mid-afternoon. Vera stood in the clearing until their car was gone. Then she went inside and opened the bottom right drawer of Earl's desk. The tin box sat exactly as she had left it. She had spent the last 2 weeks searching the room methodically when she had time. That morning, going through the freight ledgers page by page before Adler arrived, she had found it tucked in the back corner of the bottom left drawer beneath a folded survey map. A second key, smaller than the brass key on the ring, iron rather than brass, the bow plain and round. She picked up the tin box and tried it. The lock turned. The lid released from its wax seal with the sound of something held for a very long time letting go. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a length of ribbon gone nearly colorless with age. She lifted the bundle out and set it on the desk. The top letter was postmarked Knoxville, 1957. The return address read, Calder Gallery, Gay Street, Knoxville. She untied the ribbon and read, William Calder, gallery owner. He wrote that he had seen one of Earl's paintings and wished to discuss the work. He asked whether Earl might bring more pieces to Knoxville for his consideration. She read the next letter. Earl had gone to Calder's gallery in the spring of 1958 and brought 3 canvases. Calder's response said he found the work remarkable in its originality and its precision and wished to offer Earl a showing. A small exhibition of the Valley paintings in the autumn of 1959. Earl's reply was brief. He thanked Calder for his generosity, but explained that personal circumstances did not permit him to proceed. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. There were 4 more letters after that. Calder had written twice more, urging Earl to reconsider, telling him that work of this quality belonged in front of people. In the final letter, postmarked 1960, Calder enclosed a handwritten appraisal of the 3 canvases Earl had brought to the gallery, valuing them at a combined figure that represented several months of a freight agent's salary. At the bottom of the appraisal, in different ink, as if added after the fact, these will be worth considerably more in time. Vera sat with the letters in her lap. Earl had known. A trained man with a gallery on Gay Street had told him plainly what the work was, had offered him the recognition he had earned through 27 years of early mornings, and Earl had declined it and sealed the evidence in a tin box and gone home to Beatrice and said nothing. She did not know whether to feel grief for what he had given up or something closer to understanding. He had made a choice about what his life required and had lived with it without complaint, and he had left everything in this room in the hope that someone would come. She had come. The choice no longer needed protecting. Spring arrived in the Tennessee hills with its usual stubbornness, cold one week and warm the next, and then one morning in April that felt like a decision. The ridge above the depot went from bare gray to the specific yellow-green of new leaf. The freight yard put out green under the sections Vera had cleared. The first genuinely warm morning, she sat on the platform foundation and drank her coffee in the sun and did not feel the cold working through her coat. Ray and his nephew Eddie came back in April for the full roof repair. A structural engineer came with them the first day, walked the entire building, and gave Vera the assessment she had suspected. The main structure was sound throughout. Good brick, good foundation, good framing. The addition needed new rafters on the east half. The main roof needed only a few rotted rafter tails replaced and proper flashing at the ridge. 2 weeks of work. When it was done, the depot stood under a complete and weathertight roof for the first time in decades. The first rain came 3 days later. Vera stood in the freight room and listened to it move across the roof. Clean and even, not a single drip anywhere in the building. She made coffee and sat on the workbench and listened to the rain and thought about her grandfather doing something similar in this room 60 years ago, in the same general silence, with the same general satisfaction of a building that was holding. A reporter from the Knoxville paper called Margaret Sohn in early May after Thomas Adler mentioned the depot discovery at a university symposium. Margaret asked Vera's permission before saying anything, which Vera appreciated, and Vera said yes. The story ran the following week. A local woman had bought a condemned freight station at county auction for $7, found 12 oil paintings made in secret by her grandfather, and a historian from the Knoxville Museum had confirmed the work as significant. There was a photograph of 2 paintings and one of the depot exterior. The story was accurate and not sensationalized, and Vera read it once and set it on the workbench and went back to work. Dale called 4 days after the story appeared. Cheryl at the Crossroads store handed her the phone when she came in for supplies. His voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who has been rehearsing what they plan to say and has decided at the last moment to abandon the script. He said he'd seen the article. He said he was glad she was well. He asked if he and Sandra could come see the place. When? Vera asked. Whatever weekend was best for her. She thought about the courthouse steps. The 2 phone calls in 8 months. The quality of those calls. Come Saturday, she said. Both of you. They arrived mid-morning, coming around the side of the building where Vera was clearing the last section of briars from the freight yard. Dale was heavier than the last time she had seen him. Sandra looked tired around the eyes in the settled way of someone who had been carrying something for a long time. They were dressed casually and carefully, the way people dress when they want to appear relaxed and have thought about it. She set down the handsaw and let them come to her. This is extraordinary, Sandra said, looking at the depot. The pointed brick walls, the new roof, the cleared yard, the loading crane at the far end of the platform catching the morning sun. It's a building that needed work, Vera said. I gave it work. She took them through the freight room and its cleaned windows and swept floor, the stationmaster's room with its shelves and its desk and the chair Earl had used for 38 years. She opened one painting and leaned it against the wall in the south light and let them look at it without saying anything. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He never said a word about any of this, Dale said. Grandpa Earl. He kept it here. They were quiet in the room the way most people went quiet in it once they understood what it had been. What it had held, what had been protected inside it. Outside in the freight yard, in the May warmth, Dale started to say something and stopped himself and tried again. He said they had handled things badly. He said he knew that. Sandra said there was nothing she could say that would undo what they hadn't done. She said she knew that too. She asked if there was anything that could be done from here. Vera looked at them both. I want to tell you what happened after you left me on that sidewalk, she said. Not to cause you more pain than you're already carrying. Because if you don't know the full account, we can't build anything real from where we are now. She told them. She did not raise her voice, and she did not soften the facts. The church shelter and the night on the courthouse steps. The auction room and the laughter. The first night on the freight room floor with a wool blanket and a lantern and $7 less than she'd started the day with. The clay mortar she mixed with her bare hands to seal the windows in March. Ray bringing food twice a week without being asked. The 4-mile walks to the Crossroads store in the cold. The key in her mother's Bible, and the room it opened, and the man who had kept his entire inner life behind a locked door for 31 years because the people closest to him didn't make space for it. She held up her hands briefly. The work was still written into them. I did all of this without family, she said. I had strangers who showed up because that is what honest people do. Not once did either of you call. Dale's jaw tightened. We didn't know where you were. You knew the county. You knew how to find Ray Perkins's hardware store if you had looked. Finding me was not the hard part. The silence that followed had the quality of honesty rather than hostility. Long enough that it became something real rather than something to fill. Sandra spoke first. "Is there a way forward?" she asked. Genuinely asked, not as performance. Vera thought about it the way she thought about structural problems. Honestly, without sentiment, looking for what was actually there. "Come back without needing anything from me," she said. "Come because you want to know who I am now, not because a newspaper ran a story. I'm not interested in transactions. I've had enough of those." She looked at both of them. "That door is open. Nothing else is yet. You'll have to earn the rest." They stayed another hour. Before they left, Sandra stopped at the freight room entrance and looked back at the building. "Did it feel like him?" she asked. "When you were in there?" "It felt like finding out who he was," Vera said, "which is better than what I had before." They drove away down the gravel track. Vera stood in the clearing until the dust settled. She felt nothing dramatic. She felt the afternoon around her, the sun on the brick walls, the smell of new growth from the freight yard, the low sound of wind coming through the ridge pines behind the depot. She went back inside and sat at Earl's desk. The Knoxville Museum had sent a formal exhibition proposal the previous week. 12 paintings, conservation assessment, documentation, a small show to run in the fall. Thomas Adler had written the proposal himself. Vera had read it twice and had Patsy read it over the phone and would sign the agreement when the documentation was finished. One condition: the paintings returned to the depot after the exhibition. Adler had agreed to that without discussion. William Calder's appraisal from 1960 was framed now and hung on the Stationmaster's wall above the desk. It seemed like the right place. The man who had recognized Earl's work and been turned down had at least made it into the room eventually, in a way. Roy had not called. She had not expected him to and did not want him to. What she had built in this place had nothing to do with him and never would. She turned the brass key over in her palm, the number 8 stamped in the bow, the key her grandfather had used to lock this room for the last time in the autumn of 1962. He had written, "The best part of my working life. No regrets about any of it." She understood that now in a way she could not have understood it before March. The best parts of a life are sometimes the parts that happen in the margins, before the rest of the world arrives, in the hour that belongs entirely to you. Earl had known that. He had organized 31 years of mornings around that knowledge and left the evidence of it on a shelf behind a locked door and trusted the building to hold it. The building had held it. She set the key on the desk and looked through the open Stationmaster's door into the freight room. Spring light across the oak floor, the windows clean, the main entrance doors standing open to the freight yard and the ridge beyond. She had arrived here with $7 and a sleeping bag and a key that didn't fit the front door. She had a building that everyone at the auction had been certain was worthless, and the man who built it and the man who kept it had both been right about what it was when no one else could see it. She was not rescued. She had not waited to be found. She had bought the key and turned it herself, and everything that came after was the result of that. The afternoon light moved across the freight room floor. In the freight yard, the shadow of the depot's brick gable lay across the concrete loading surface at the same angle Earl had painted in his July canvas. The same yard, the same ridge, the same light that had been here every morning for 100 years and would be here after her. She was home. The conservation team came in June. 2 people from the museum with flat transport cases and white cotton gloves, and the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that what they were handling had been waiting a long time and deserved to be treated accordingly. Priya led the work. She examined each canvas under a portable light source, made detailed notes on condition, took measurements. The paintings were in better shape than she had expected given the decades of storage. The Stationmaster's room had held a relatively stable temperature and humidity, sealed as it was, and the oilcloth wrapping had done its job. 2 canvases showed minor cracking in the paint layer at the edges. Nothing that required intervention before the exhibition. Nothing that couldn't travel. Vera watched from the freight room doorway while they worked. Priya paused over the July freight yard painting, the one Earl had made from almost exactly the position where Vera now stood. She tilted it toward the portable light and ran the loops slowly across the surface. "He built up the rust color in at least 6 layers," she said, not to Vera specifically, more to the room. "Each one slightly different. That's not instinct. That's someone who looked at the same thing so many times he understood it from the inside." She set it down carefully and moved to the next one. Vera went outside and walked the perimeter of the building while they finished. The freight yard was clear now from the depot to the loading area, the concrete surface swept and solid. She had planted a row of pole beans along the south wall in May, and they had come up straight and were climbing the wire she had stapled to the old brick, reaching for the eave. 2 tomato plants in a raised bed she had built from scrap lumber, the soil turned from the creek bottom compost she had been building since March. George's raised beds on Maple Street had been Roy's work. These were hers. The paintings left the depot on a Thursday morning in the first week of July. Vera stood at the main entrance and watched Priya and her colleague load the transport cases into the museum vehicle. She had signed the agreement and understood the terms and trusted Thomas Adler's word. But she stood there until the last case was closed and the vehicle had turned out of the clearing and gone down the gravel track and disappeared into the trees. Then she went to the stationmaster's room. The shelves where the paintings had stood were empty. The freight ledgers remained. 38 years of Earl's careful handwriting still in order on the left-hand side. The personal ledgers to the right. The tin box on the desk with its lid resting beside it. The Calder letters inside in their ribbon. The room was the same room. The absence of the canvases was noticeable in the way that a room notices the removal of something that has been part of it for a long time, even when the thing was hidden. She sat at the desk. She thought about Earl the morning he locked this door for the last time. October of 1962. He had been 59 years old, for years older than Vera had been when Roy filed. He had driven away from the depot in whatever vehicle he had then and gone to Beatrice and the children and the house in Harriman and spent 9 more years working for the county highway department without saying a word about any of it. She had not had 9 more years of silence. She had had a courthouse and a parking barrier and $7 in her coat pocket and a Bible that turned out to be carrying more than anyone knew. She had ended up here. She did not believe Earl had planned for her specifically. She believed he had planned for whoever came, and she had come, and that was enough. She opened the first personal ledger and read for an hour, the afternoon light moving across the desk in the way it always moved, the freight yard quiet outside the open doors. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening in September. Thomas Adler had sent 2 formal invitations, and the museum had offered to arrange a hotel room for the night. Ray drove her to Knoxville in his truck without being asked. Patsy came down from Millhaven in her own car, because she had decided somewhere in August that this was not an event she was willing to miss, and she arrived at the museum 30 minutes before Vera did, and had already found the coat check. The gallery was a long, narrow room on the museum's 2nd floor, the walls painted a warm off-white that worked with the paintings, rather than against them. The 12 canvases were hung in a single row along the main wall, spaced evenly, lit by a track system angled to approximate morning light. Below each painting, a small card, the title in Earl's own handwriting, the date range, and a brief note from Adler on what the painting showed and where Earl had stood when he made it. Vera walked in and stopped. She had seen all 12 canvases dozens of times. She had handled each one, unwrapped it, moved it, leaned it against a wall in various lights. She knew their surfaces and their colors and the specific way each one handled the light of the Tennessee hills. She had not seen them like this before. On the wall in that room, properly lit, properly spaced, with the considered distance between herself and them that a museum provides, they were something she had not fully understood while she was living among them. The row of them together told a story she had only read in pieces. 31 years of the same valley, the same ridge, the same freight yard, the same light returning season after season, and a man who had stood in front of all of it before his shift began and found that looking carefully at one place was the same as looking carefully at everything. She stood in front of the July freight yard painting for a long time. Ray came to stand beside her. He looked at the canvas and then at the card below it, the title in Earl's handwriting. He knew exactly what he had, Ray said. He did, Vera said. He just didn't know what to do with knowing. Patsy found them after a while, and the 3 of them walked the row together, all the way to the end and back. The room had filled by then. People Vera had never met, standing in front of Earl's paintings, taking them in. A man in his 60s stood in front of the Winter Ridge painting for several minutes, without moving. A young woman photographed the July freight yard canvas on her phone and then stood looking at the original for a long time afterward, as if checking whether the photograph had caught what was actually there. It hadn't. Photographs never do entirely. Thomas Adler came over and told her the opening had drawn more people than he had anticipated and that 2 regional papers had sent photographers. He said the Calder Gallery letters and the 1960 appraisal were on display in the exhibition's second room, and that several visitors had spent a long time with Calder's final notation. These will be worth considerably more in time. She thanked him. Dale and Sandra were there. She had told them about the opening when they came back to the depot in July, the second visit, the one that had been without agenda. That visit had been quieter and less weighted than the first. Dale had helped her move lumber for the bean bed without being asked and without making a point of it. Sandra had sat with the personal ledgers for an hour inside the stationmaster's room and come out with red eyes she didn't mention and didn't need to. They had eaten lunch on the platform foundation in the afternoon sun and talked about things that had nothing to do with the courthouse or the year behind them. She had mentioned the exhibition and they had come. She saw them now across the gallery, standing together in front of the Winter Ridge painting. Not talking, just looking at it. The painting Earl had made one February morning in the 1950s, the ridge reduced to a bare dark edge against a white sky. She left them to it. Ray drove her back to Tanner's Creek that night. South out of Knoxville on familiar roads, the city falling away behind them and the hills coming up on both sides and the dark thickening in the way it does in places far enough from the lights of anywhere. The gravel approach in the headlights. The clearing. She got out and stood in front of the depot. The building was dark, the freight yard quiet, the ridge above a black shape against a sky dense with stars. The particular star density of places the city hasn't reached. She stood there for a while without going in. The exhibition would run 6 weeks. The paintings would come back in November, and she would unwrap each one and return it to the shelf in the order Earl had kept them. Adler had mentioned a catalog, a published document of the full body of work with scholarly notes. He had mentioned an acquisition inquiry from a private collector in Chattanooga. Vera had told him she would think about that, which she would, carefully and without hurry, and whatever she decided would be the right decision because it would be hers to make. The depot had other work still ahead of it. The main entrance doors needed new hardware, solid hardware, the kind that would last. The freight room floor needed attention in the section nearest the addition where the old subfloor had softened from years of moisture before the roof was fixed. The freight yard had a second section still uncleared beyond the loading area. Small work, steady work, the kind that organizes a life. She was 71 years old. She had arrived at this building stripped of almost everything a person can be stripped of. She had found it condemned and sealed and laughed at. And she had bought it for $7 while a room full of people waited for her to realize her mistake. There had been no mistake. She thought about what Earl had written. The best part of my working life. No regrets about any of it. She had been thrown out of a house she kept for 38 years and had found, 9 miles from a county courthouse and 62 years after her grandfather locked a door, a room that had been waiting specifically for her, holding what it held, patient and sealed and solid. She thought about the courthouse steps and the cardboard box and the man at the auction in the canvas jacket who had asked her, not unkindly, if she had somewhere else to go. She had found somewhere. She went inside, lit the lantern on the workbench, and sat at Earl's desk. The freight yard was quiet beyond the open doors. The ridge was dark, the same ridge he had stood in front of before his shifts for 31 years, painting the light as it changed season by season, morning by morning, getting it wrong, and getting it less wrong and getting it, in the end, more right than he had ever given himself credit for. She picked up the brass key, held it for a moment, set it back down. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and the building around her knew it, and the ridge above the freight yard knew it, and somewhere in the careful ordering of things, she thought, Earl Monroe Marsh knew it too. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.